YN had never been a party girl. She wasn't the type to go out clubbing, preferring the quiet comfort of her room with a good book or some music. But tonight, her two best friends, Hana and Jisoo, weren't having it. They dragged her out to a popular club in the heart of the city, insisting it would be good for her to let loose. "I don't even know why you're making such a big deal about this," Jisoo had said, tossing YN a glass of something strong and fruity the moment they entered. "I just don't do clubs," YN mumbled, sipping the drink reluctantly. The moment the alcohol hit, she felt the tension in her body begin to dissolve. It was easier to just go along with them. After an hour, the three girls found themselves on the dance floor, surrounded by flashing lights and pulsing beats. YN wasn't much of a dancer, but the music had a hold on her, pulling her into the rhythm as Hana and Jisoo cheered her on. That's when she saw him. He stood out among the crowd, a tall, handsome stranger with a confident swagger. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to still be around them. Without a word, he stepped forward, his hand gently brushing against hers. Without even thinking, YN let herself be led to the dance floor. Their bodies moved together, a perfect synchronicity as the music grew louder and the heat between them intensified. His hands were firm yet gentle on her waist, guiding her closer, their bodies pressed together in a way that left her breathless. She felt an electricity between them undeniable, raw. For the rest of the night, time seemed to blur. They lost themselves in each other, in the music, in the intensity of their connection. The crowd around them faded, and all that existed was the moment, the way his hands held her close, the way his lips brushed against her ear as they danced. When the night ended, they ended up somewhere private, somewhere where the tension that had been building between them finally snapped. Their bodies collided with an urgency, a need that neither could resist. The world outside disappeared, and for just one night, they were no longer strangers. Weeks passed, but YN couldn't shake the memories of that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face and heard his voice. It haunted her. She couldn't believe how deeply he had affected her in just a few hours. "I can't believe you're still thinking about that guy," they teased her during their lunch break one afternoon. "You were all over him that night. He must have been something special." YN rolled her eyes, trying to hide the blush creeping up her neck. "I'm not thinking about it, okay?" she said, pushing her food around on her plate. "Sure you're not," Hannah laughed. "Oh, by the way, we're getting a new professor for chemistry. My friend heard he's super handsome. Maybe you'll get lucky again." She winked. YN barely listened, not caring much about the new professor. "Yeah, whatever," she mumbled, pretending not to be interested. The next day, as she walked into the lecture hall, YN couldn't have prepared herself for the surprise that awaited her. There, standing at the front of the class, was none other than the stranger from the club. Her breath hitched as her eyes locked onto his, and his expression flickered with surprise. But he quickly composed himself and began his introduction. YN couldn't focus on a single word he said. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She couldn't believe this was happening. How could she not have recognized him sooner? How was it possible that the man who had turned her world upside down was now her professor? Throughout the class, she couldn't tear her gaze away from him. He, too, stole glances at her, though his eyes were harder to read. The electricity that had crackled between them that night seemed to linger in the air, both of them aware of it, yet neither willing to acknowledge it. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, YN stood to leave, her legs shaking. She needed to get out of there, but Jungkook's voice stopped her. "Miss YN," he called, his tone cool yet somehow deeper than before. I need you to drop the attendance register off in my office. Her heart raced as she nodded, unable to speak. She tried to shake off the feeling of déjà vu as she walked down the hallway toward his office. When she entered his office, the door clicked shut behind her, and the air instantly grew thick with tension. She handed him the register, but as she turned to leave, he stepped closer. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Winnie's heart raced as she tried to keep her composure. "There's nothing to talk about," she stammered, backing up slightly. "I need to go. I have another class." But Jungkook wasn't having it. He cornered her, his presence overwhelming. "You can't just pretend like nothing happened between us," he said, his gaze dark and intense. YN couldn't deny the pull, the way her body instinctively responded to his nearness. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice faltering. Before she could say anything else, Jungkook's lips crashed onto hers, silencing her protests. His kiss was urgent and demanding, yet it was everything she remembered and more. Her hands found their way to his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt, while his hands roamed down to her waist, pulling her closer if that was even possible. The kiss deepened, and all the tension, all the memories of that night, came rushing back in full force. YN's thoughts swirled, her body betraying her as she melted into him, her mind too clouded to think clearly. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, their faces flushed, the air between them thick with something unspoken. YN's heart pounded wildly against her ribs as she struggled to steady her breath, her skin burning not just from the intensity of his kiss, but from the undeniable truth pressing against her soul. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that night had been a mistake, her body and heart told a different story. Every time he was near, she felt it, the pull, the heat, the lingering desire that refused to fade. But this was dangerous. He was her professor now. She was just a student. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to stay away, to pretend none of this happened. But the moment his deep voice called her name again, she knew she was doomed. YN. She looked up, swallowing hard as her eyes met his dark brown orbs, intense, unreadable, yet holding something that sent a shiver down her spine. Jungkook stood close, his hands resting on either side of her waist, his jaw slightly tensed as if he was debating something internally. The air between them was thick, charged with something neither of them dared to name. Then, with a sharp exhale, his resolve seemed to snap. Without hesitation, he stepped even closer, closing the fragile gap between them. "I can't do this," he admitted, his voice lower now, more vulnerable. "I can't pretend that night meant nothing. I can't stop thinking about you, YN." His dark eyes locked onto hers, making her breath hitch. "That night, you've been in my head every damn day." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "It's driving me insane. I like you, YN, a lot. And I don't care if it's wrong. I want you." YN felt like the world had tilted beneath her feet. Her stomach flipped at his words, but fear quickly settled in. "Jungkook, you're my professor now. This is completely wrong," he interrupted. "Maybe by some rules, but you and I both know what we have is real." He took another step forward, his fingers grazing her waist gently. "I don't want to fight this anymore, YN. I want to be with you." She took a shaky breath, her mind racing. "Jungkook, if someone finds out, you could lose your job. I could get in trouble." He sighed, but his gaze didn't waver. "I know the risks. That's why we'll keep it a secret. No one has to know until you graduate." His voice softened as he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Then, when you do, I want to make you mine forever." YN's eyes widened. "You're talking about marrying you?" Jungkook confirmed, his lips curling into a small smile. I'm serious about you, YN. I don't want this to be just some hidden fling. I want you, only you. Her heart thundered in her chest, emotions clashing between fear and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. It was risky. It was reckless. But the way Jungkook was looking at her, the sincerity in his voice, made it impossible to resist. She knew she was falling, and there was no way out. Okay, she finally whispered, meeting his gaze. But we have to be careful. Jungkook's smile widened, a glint of mischief flashing in his eyes. Careful? Baby, I'm already struggling not to kiss you right now. She blushed, smacking his arm lightly. Jungkook, he chuckled before leaning down, pressing his forehead against her. I'll always be there for you. Why, no matter what. As she looked up at him, her heart swelling, she knew she was his. And he was hers. Her lips parted, but before she could say anything, Jungkook pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. The simple act made her heart flutter wildly, but just as she thought he was done, he trailed lower and planted another lingering kiss on her cheek right, where her blush was deepening. He pulled back slightly, eyes glinting with playful mischief. You know, he mused, his fingers gently pinching her flushed cheek. I really love how your rosy cheeks give away exactly what you're thinking. His lips brushed her ear as he whispered, It's adorable, and it makes me want to kiss you even more. YN let out a small whine, completely flustered, her cheeks burning even hotter. She buried her face in his chest, mumbling, You're impossible. Jungkook smirked. And you're adorable. He countered. And he hugged her. But you're mine now, and I'm not letting you go. YN's heart raced at his words, knowing that despite all the risks, despite all the fear, she didn't want to let go either. And no matter the risks, they would find a way.